the Kronos Kaleidoscope. The attic of 17 Hawthorne Lane was a kingdom of forgotten things. It was a place where dust motes danced in slanting afternoon light, where the ghosts of Christmases past whispered from cardboard boxes, and where the air smelled perpetually of cedar and decay. For 12-year-old Paul Drake, it was the only interesting part of the old Victorian house his family had just inherited from a great-uncle he'd never met. Uncle Alistair had been, by all accounts, an eccentric. A clockmaker by trade and a recluse by choice, he had filled his house with the skeletal remains of timepieces. Grandfather clocks with silent pendulums, carriage clocks with tarnished brass, and 1,000 smaller mechanisms whose purposes were lost to memory. The attic was his inner sanctum, the place where his most peculiar projects had been conceived and, presumably, abandoned. Paul was up there because the rest of the house was a mausoleum of his parents' quiet grief. The move from the city had been sudden, a desperate grasp at a fresh start after the incident with his older brother Leo. Downstairs, his mother moved through rooms like a phantom, her smiles fragile as glass. His father buried himself in paperwork, the clack of his keyboard a feeble defense against the silence. The air was thick with things unsaid, and the attic, for all its dust and shadows, was a refuge. It was on the third day of exploration, behind a moth-eaten velvet curtain depicting a hunting scene that made Paul queasy, that he found the false wall. A section of the paneling, indistinguishable from the rest, gave way under his persistent pushing with a soft click. Beyond was a small, dark space, no larger than a broom closet. In the center, on a simple wooden workbench, sat the kaleidoscope. It wasn't a child's toy. It was 1.5 feet long, forged from a dark, non-reflective metal that seemed to drink the light. One end was a complex eyepiece made of layered lenses and polished obsidian, while the other tapered to a grip wrapped in worn, black leather. Along its barrel, intricate brass filigree swirled in patterns that were almost, but not quite, celestial or mathematical. They looked more like the visual representation of a chaotic thought. It was heavy, cold, and hummed with a sub-audible vibration that Paul felt in his teeth. There was no note, no instruction manual, just the kaleidoscope, resting on a stand carved from a single piece of smoky quartz. Drawn by an impulse he didn't understand, Paul lifted it. The hum intensified, a thrumming energy that traveled up his arm and settled in his chest. He raised it to his eye. He expected a shower of colored glass. What he saw was his own attic, but wrong. The colors were inverted, a photographic negative of reality. The dust was black, the light shafts were dark, and the shadows glowed with a sickly, actinic light. And in the center of the room, where his own feet should be, stood a translucent, shimmering figure, a boy his own age with his own face but gaunt and terrified, mouth open in a silent scream. The figure reached for him just as a wave of vertigo so powerful it felt like his soul was being wrung out slammed into Paul. He dropped the kaleidoscope, stumbling back, gasping for air. The vision was gone. The attic was just an attic again. His heart hammered against his ribs. He stared at the device on the floor, its sinister hum now silent. It wasn't a kaleidoscope. He didn't have the words for what it was, but the terror in his own ghostly double's eyes was a language he understood perfectly. For a week, he left it alone. The memory of that inverted world and the screaming doppelganger was a cold stone in his gut. But the memory was also a lure. The hum, the vibration, the sheer impossibility of it. It called to him. It was a secret. And secrets, for a lonely boy in a house of sorrows, are irresistible. He went back. This time he was more careful. He didn't look through it immediately. He experimented. He found that by twisting the brass rings along the barrel, the pitch of the hum changed. One ring seemed to control focus. The closer he turned it, the sharper the inverted image became. Another seemed to control when. He discovered this by accident. Thinking of Leo, he twisted the second ring, and the inverted attic flickered. For a fraction of a second, he saw a different box, a newer one, labeled Leo's Things in his mother's handwriting. It was a box he knew was currently in his brother's old bedroom, untouched since they moved. He'd seen the future of the attic. His breath caught. Time. This was a time machine. The horror of the first vision was eclipsed by a torrent of wild, desperate hope. Leo. He could see Leo again. Not the Leo in the hospital bed, pale and still, but the real Leo. The Leo who taught him how to skateboard, who covered for him when he broke a window, whose laugh could fill a whole house. He spent days practicing in the attic. He learned to control the view, panning across the inverted space like a camera. He saw the attic as it was last week, empty. He saw it 10 years ago, filled with strange machines and blueprints he didn't understand. Uncle Alistair at work. He saw it 50 years in the future, a ruin open to the elements, a tree growing through the floorboards. Each journey was taxing. He'd emerge nauseous, with a splitting headache, his nose sometimes bleeding a little. The device was a parasite, feeding on something inside him. But he was getting better. He learned to anchor his view to a person, not just a place. He found he could follow a temporal scent, a thread of causality. He focused all his will, all his memory, on his brother. He twisted the dial, the inverted. Worlds swam, colors and shapes blurring into a nauseating vortex. He felt a tearing sensation, as if his mind were being stretched across years. He gritted his teeth, holding the image of Leo in his head. His floppy brown hair, the chip in his front tooth, the way he'd squint when he was thinking. The vortex snapped into focus. He was looking into his old living room in the city. The sun was streaming through the big bay window. It was the day of the accident, 7 months ago. There was Leo, 16 years old and vibrantly alive, arguing with their mother. He was wearing his favorite green hoodie, the one he was later cut out of in the emergency room. "Mom, it's just a bike ride to the quarry. Everyone's going." Leo's voice was tinny, distant, as if coming from a cheap radio, but it was his voice. Paul's heart felt like it was cracking open. "Not in this weather, Leo. The roads are slick. I have a bad feeling about this." His mother's face was pinched with an anxiety that, in hindsight, was prophetic. "It's just a little drizzle. God, you never let me do anything." Leo threw his hands up in exasperation, a familiar, dramatic gesture that Paul had mimicked 100 times. Paul watched powerless as the ghost of an argument he'd mostly slept through that Saturday morning played out. He saw himself, his past self, shuffle into the room in pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes, asking if there was any cereal. Leo had ruffled his hair, a brief moment of affection amidst the tension. "Hey, Slugger, don't worry. I'll be back before you're even dressed." That was the last time Leo touched him. Paul wanted to scream, to pound on the invisible barrier between him and this scene. "Don't go! Listen to her!" But he was just a spectator, a ghost in his own past. He watched Leo grab his helmet, a pointless formality it would turn out, and slam the front door. The sound was a gunshot in Paul's soul. The view flickered, the strain too much. He lost his grip on the timeline and was flung forward. The inverted colors swirled and resolved into a new scene, one he hadn't witnessed. The hospital corridor. His parents, huddled together on a plastic bench. His father's shoulders were shaking. His mother's face was a mask of such utter, absolute devastation that Paul felt a physical pain in his chest. A doctor was talking to them, his mouth moving, but Paul couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He knew them. Severe traumatic. Brain injury, no brain activity. We need to discuss organ donation. The world in the kaleidoscope began to fracture at the edges, dark tendrils of nothingness creeping into the inverted image. The headache behind his eyes became a white-hot drill. He saw the gaunt, screaming version of himself from his first vision flicker at the periphery again, closer this time. A warning. He tore the kaleidoscope from his eye, collapsing onto the dusty floorboards, sobbing. He had gone looking for comfort and found only a fresh hell. He had witnessed the moment his family broke, and the pain was as raw and real as the day it happened. For 2 days, he didn't touch the device. He lay in bed, listless, the images burned onto the back of his eyelids. His mother noticed his pallor and put a cool hand on his forehead, asking if he was coming down with something. Her touch, usually a comfort, felt like a brand. He had seen the depth of her sorrow, and it made him feel like an intruder in his own life. But as the acute pain receded, a new, dangerous thought emerged. A thought born of desperation and a child's flawed logic. He couldn't just watch. What if he could do something? The idea was madness. Every instinct, every flickering vision of his terrified double screamed at him that it was a cataclysmic mistake. But the image of Leo, alive and whole, was a siren song. What was the point of having a time machine if you couldn't fix the one thing that mattered? He formulated a plan. A simple, stupid plan. He would go back to that morning, just for a moment. He wouldn't talk to Leo, wouldn't show himself. He would find Leo's bike and let the air out of the tires. A flat tire. That's all it would take. Leo would be delayed, frustrated, maybe even grounded. But he would be alive. He'd be upstairs right now. Probably complaining about how boring Hawthorne Lane was. He didn't understand the rules. He didn't understand that time isn't a river you can step in and out of, but a fragile, interwoven tapestry. Pull one thread, and the whole thing can unravel. He waited until his parents were asleep. The house was a tomb, the only sound the ticking of 100 dead clocks. He crept up to the attic, the kaleidoscope heavy in his hands. This time it felt different. The hum was more insistent, almost eager. The metal was warmer, as if feeding on his resolve. He focused. Not on watching, but on going. He thought of the garage of their old house, the smell of gasoline and grass clippings, the red mountain bike leaning against the wall. He twisted the when dial with a trembling hand, pinpointing the moment, an hour after Leo's argument, just before he would have gone to get his bike. The vortex this time was violent. It wasn't a stretching, but a ripping. The inverted colors bled together into a screaming maelstrom of non-light. The gaunt double was there, not at the periphery, but right in front of him. Its silent scream now a palpable wave of psychic terror. The dark tendrils from the hospital vision swarmed in, licking at the edges of his consciousness. He heard things, the sound of tearing fabric, of bones snapping, of a million clocks all striking 13 at once. He ignored it all. He focused on the bike, the red paint, the chipped reflector. With a final gut-wrenching lurch, the maelstrom ceased. He was standing in the garage. The air was cool and damp, smelling exactly as he remembered. He could hear the faint sound of the television from inside the house. He was there. He had done it. Elation, pure and dizzying, flooded him. He looked down at his own body. It was faintly shimmering like a heat haze. He was a ghost in the past. He saw the bike. He hurried over, his shimmering fingers fumbling for the valve cap. His hand passed straight through the metal. Panic seized him. He was incorporeal, a spectator, just like before. He tried again, concentrating with all his might, imagining his fingers as solid. This time he felt a faint resistance, like pushing through thick syrup. He managed to grasp the valve cap. It was like trying to hold smoke. He twisted. Nothing. Frantically, he looked around for something, anything. A nail? A sharp tool? His gaze fell on a workbench. A set of screwdrivers. He reached for one, his hand phase-shifting through the handle several times before he managed to get a weak grip. It was like lifting a car. Every ounce of his will was focused on making the tool solid in his hand. He stumbled back to the bike, the screwdriver feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He raised it, aiming for the front tire. He was going to puncture it. He had to. At that moment, the garage door creaked open. It was Leo. He was humming a tune, heading for his bike. He stopped dead when he saw Paul. His eyes widened. He saw a shimmering, ghostly apparition of his little brother, holding a screwdriver poised over his bike tire. The expression on Paul's face was one of manic desperation. "Paul?" Leo whispered, his voice full of confusion and fear. What are you doing? How did you... You look weird," Paul froze. This was all wrong. He opened his mouth to say something, to explain, but all that came out was a static-filled gasp. The strain of maintaining his form was immense. He felt himself flickering, the garage walls becoming transparent, the terrible screeching of the vortex beginning to bleed through. Leo took a step back, terrified. What is this? Some kind of joke? The timeline was fracturing. Paul could feel it. The air began to crackle with ozone. The objects in the garage started to phase in and out of existence. The bike was red, then it was blue, then it was a child's tricycle. "Stay away from me," Leo yelled, turning to run back into the house. "Leo, wait!" Paul screamed, his voice a distorted echo, but it was too late. Leo yanked the door open and dashed inside. Paul, in a final desperate act, tried to follow, to stop him, to explain. He lunged for the door, but his form was too unstable. He passed through the wood just as Leo, in his panic, slipped on the throw rug in the hallway. Paul watched, helpless as time seemed to slow down. Leo's feet went out from under him. He fell, not forward, but sideways. His head, instead of hitting the soft carpet as it had in the original timeline, connected with the sharp, solid oak corner of the hall table with a sickening, wet crack. The sound was final, absolute, a wave of wrongness. A physical shockwave of distorted causality erupted from the spot where Leo fell. The world around Paul began to dissolve. The walls melted like wet paper, revealing the screaming chaos of the vortex beneath. The last thing Paul saw was Leo's body, motionless on the floor, in a rapidly expanding pool of blood that was the wrong shade of crimson. The last thing he heard was not his mother's scream from the kitchen, but a million screams from a million fractured realities, all converging on this one terrible point of failure. Then, nothing. Paul woke up on the cold attic floorboards of 17 Hawthorne Lane. He was drenched in a cold sweat, vomiting bile. His head felt like it had been split with an axe. The kaleidoscope lay beside him, its metal now scorching hot, the brass filigree glowing with a faint, malevolent orange light. He had failed. He had made it worse. He had to know how much worse. With a trembling, sobbing breath, he forced himself to lift the device again. He had to see his present. He had to know if his family was still there. He looked. The inverted image of the house was dark, washed in deep blues and purples. It was freezing cold. He panned down towards the living room. His mother was there. She was sitting in her armchair, staring at a wall. But it wasn't his mother. Her hair was streaked with white. Her face was gaunt and lined with a grief so profound it had physically reshaped her. She was rocking back and forth, clutching not a photo of Leo, but a small, worn teddy bear that had belonged to Paul when he was a toddler. Where am I? Paul thought, a fresh terror seizing him. He found his father in the study. The man was a shell, hollow-eyed, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles. He was talking to a framed picture on his desk. Paul zoomed in. It was a picture of himself. From his 7th birthday. Should have watched him more closely, his father slurred to the photo. My fault, my boy. My Paul. A cold dread, colder than the attic floor, seeped into Paul's bones. He swung the kaleidoscope around, searching the house, his room. It was empty. His bed was made, untouched. His posters were gone. His model airplanes were gone. It was a guest room. He didn't exist here. In his stupid, reckless attempt to save Leo, he had erased himself. He had created a timeline where both sons were dead. Leo from a fall in the hallway. Paul Drake, from never being born at all. He was a paradox, a ghost haunting the attic of a life that was no longer his. This was the horror the gaunt double had been trying to warn him about. Not just death, but unbirth, non-existence. He stumbled down from the attic, his legs barely supporting him. He had to see them, to touch them, to prove he was still real. Mom? he croaked, entering the living room. The woman in the chair didn't look up. She kept rocking. "Mom, it's me, Paul." She hummed a tuneless lullaby, stroking the teddy bear's head. He ran to his father's study. "Dad!" His father looked up from the photograph, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. They passed right through Paul. "Hear things again," he muttered to himself, pouring another drink. "The doctor said I might hear things." Paul was a ghost in his own house. He was invisible, inaudible. He was a memory that had never been made. He fled back to the attic, the only place where his stolen existence had any anchor. He grabbed the kaleidoscope. He had to fix it. He had to undo what he had done. He tried to go back to the garage to stop himself, but the device resisted. The vortex was a storm of shattered glass and screaming faces, his own face 1,000 times over, in 1,000 states of agony. The timeline had calloused around the wound he'd inflicted. It had sealed the break with a scar of pure chaos, and he was trapped on the wrong side of it. He was adrift. Days bled into weeks. He learned the rules of his new existence. He could interact with the physical world, but only weakly and with immense effort. He could make a door creak or a light flicker. He could knock a book off a shelf. His parents attributed these events to the house being old and full of drafts. They were living in a nightmare of his making, and they didn't even know he was the architect. He became a silent witness to their decay. His mother's lullabies became quieter, then stopped altogether. She just sat and stared. His father's drinking got worse. The house, once filled with a quiet grief, was now a hollowed-out shell of despair. He spent his time in the attic, obsessively using the kaleidoscope, not to change things, but to understand. He saw other timelines. He saw the one where Leo lived, but was permanently disabled, a burden that slowly crushed his parents' spirits. He saw one where the bike accident never happened, but Leo died a year later in a car crash. He saw one where he, Paul, had never found the kaleidoscope, and his family had eventually, painfully, begun to heal. Every reality was a unique form of torture. There was no perfect world. There was only the delicate, precious, and deeply flawed original timeline that he had shattered. He was in the attic one evening, watching his parents eat a silent, joyless dinner in the inverted world below when he saw it. A flicker. A shadow that moved with purpose. It wasn't his gaunt double. This was different. Taller, older. It moved through the kitchen wall, a patch of deeper darkness in the inverted gloom. It paused behind his mother's chair, and for a moment, it seemed to place a translucent, shadowy hand on her shoulder. A wave of intense cold radiated from the spot, and his mother shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter. Paul adjusted the focus, his heart thudding. The shadow turned, and for a split second its face was clear. It was Uncle Alistair. Or a ghost of him. His face was a mask of sorrow and grim determination. He looked directly at Paul, through the layers of reality, and shook his head slowly. A warning. Then he faded away. Alistair had known. He had known the cost. He hadn't just abandoned his creation. He had become its prisoner, a warden in the fractures of time, trying to mitigate the damage done by his terrible invention. Paul's isolation was now complete. He was not just a ghost. He was a fellow inmate in this prison of broken time, with the ghost of his predecessor as his only company. The final horror came on the anniversary of the move to Hawthorne Lane, a year in this cursed timeline. Paul was in the attic, listlessly scanning other realities, a form of self-harm he could no longer resist. He saw a world where he and Leo were old men, fishing together. He saw a world where the kaleidoscope had been found by a dictator and used to reshape the globe into a hellscape. He saw a world where time itself had broken, and past, present, and future swirled together in a screaming, perpetual storm. The strain was immense. His nose was bleeding freely, and a permanent, high-pitched whine had taken up residence in his ears. He felt the gaunt double nearby, its presence a constant cold pressure. He decided to try one last time. One last, desperate attempt to reach back through the storm and nudge one single tiny thing. Not to save Leo, not to restore himself, but just to give his parents a moment of peace. A single, happy memory to cling to in this desolate world. He focused on his mother. He would go back just a day before the accident and make her a cup of tea. A perfect cup of tea the way she liked it. A small, meaningless kindness from a son she would never know. He raised the kaleidoscope. The vortex was a wall of fury. The gaunt double was right in front of him, its mouth open in its silent scream, its eyes pools of infinite regret. The shadow of Alistair was there too, on the periphery, arms outstretched as if to hold back the tide. Paul pushed. The tearing was apocalyptic. He felt his mind, his soul, his very essence being shredded. He was aware of his body collapsing on the attic floor, but he was also elsewhere, screaming through the chaos. He burst into his old kitchen. The world was shuddering, unstable. He could see the vortex through the walls. He focused on the kettle. He focused on the tea canister. His form was barely a shimmer. He poured water, his hands phasing through the kettle. He managed to get a tea bag into a mug. It was taking forever. Every second was an eternity of agony. He heard his mother's footsteps on the stairs. Panic. He had to finish. He reached for the honey, her favorite. His hand passed through the bear-shaped bottle again and again. The footsteps were closer. With a final, desperate surge of will, he solidified his fingers for a fraction of a second. He grabbed the bottle, squeezed a glob of honey into the mug, and stirred. The kitchen door opened. His mother walked in. She stopped, seeing the steaming, freshly made mug of tea on the counter. She looked around, confused. For a beautiful, heart-stopping moment, a faint, puzzled smile touched her lips. She walked over and picked it up, smelling it. "Hello?" she called out softly. "Leo? Paul?" Hearing her say his name, in this timeline where he didn't exist, was the most painful and beautiful thing Paul had ever experienced. Then her smile faded. The confusion in her eyes deepened, then turned to a familiar, weary sadness. She shrugged, as if dismissing a strange thought, and poured the tea down the sink. "It must have been Leo," she murmured to herself, but her tone was hollow, disbelieving. Playing a trick, the hope in Paul's soul curdled into ash. His effort, his sacrifice had been for nothing. A meaningless gesture in a universe that had already written its story. The vortex reclaimed him, yanking him back with the force of a dying star. He slammed back into his body in the attic. The kaleidoscope was white-hot, the brass filigree now blackened and cracked. The hum was a death rattle. He looked through it one last time. The inverted world was disintegrating. The colors were bleeding away into a uniform static gray. The house below was fading, his parents along with it. He had stressed the local timeline beyond its breaking point. This pocket of reality was dying, and in the fading image he saw them. The gaunt double and the shadow of Alistair. They were standing together looking at him. The double, his own face, was no longer screaming. Its expression was one of pity, of acceptance. Alistair's shadow raised a hand, not in warning, but in a slow, final farewell. Then, the kaleidoscope went dark. The hum stopped. The metal cooled instantly, becoming as cold as the void between stars. It was dead. A burnt-out shell. Paul Drake lay on the floor in the silent attic. The house around him was preternaturally still. He couldn't hear his father's keyboard. He couldn't hear his mother's rocking chair. He couldn't hear anything at all. He was alone in a timeline that was breathing its last. He was the sole witness to the end of his world, a world he had murdered with the best of intentions. He closed his eyes, waiting for the gray static to claim him too, knowing that in some other reality, in some better world, a boy named Paul Drake was still alive, still whole, and blissfully unaware of the attic at 17 Hawthorne Lane and the terrible price of playing with time. But in this reality, there was only the silence, the cold and the slow, inevitable fade to nothing.